a core part of American social life. But it looks like that foundation is starting to crack. We're going to dive into the surprising new science and data that show a massive cultural shift in how we think about and drink alcohol. Okay, let's just start with a number that really stopped me in my tracks. 54%. According to brand new Gallup polling, that's how many Americans drink alcohol. And get this, that is the lowest number recorded since 1958. We are talking about a historic 60-plus year low, but that drop is directly tied to another equally powerful number. And here it is, 53%. That's how many Americans now believe that even moderate drinking is bad for your health. And no, that is not a coincidence. These two numbers are two sides of the exact same coin. This growing skepticism is really the engine driving this entire trend, and it's the key to understanding what's really going on. So first up, is America really drying out? To figure out if this is just a blip or a real cultural moment, we've got to look at the history that Gallup has been tracking for, wow, over 80 years. This shift definitely didn't happen overnight. For decades, the number of drinkers in America was pretty steady, with the last real low point way back in 1958. But the real story here is the incredible change in what we believe. I mean, think about it. Just a few years ago, back in 2015, only about 28% of people thought moderate drinking was harmful. Today, that belief has almost doubled, and it's pulling our drinking habits down to that historic low. Which brings us right to our second section, the myth of healthy alcohol. To get why everyone is so skeptical now, we have to remember the old advice. For a long time, the wisdom around alcohol wasn't just different. It was the complete opposite of what we're hearing today. We all remember this, right? The idea that a glass of red wine with dinner was actually good for your heart. That belief that a little bit of drinking was harmless or maybe even good for you, it got deeply baked into our culture. The problem? Well, it was all built on some pretty shaky science. So why did that myth stick around for so long? Well, as Professor Sarah Dermody points out, there's a pretty simple reason. For decades, scientists were almost entirely focused on the very obvious dangers of heavy drinking or binge drinking. That created this huge blind spot around moderation, and it left a lot of us to just assume that, hey, no news is good news. And that brings us to Section 3, what the science says now. Because that scientific blind spot, it's gone. We're in a totally new era of understanding, and the new consensus has completely flipped the script on alcohol and health. The old myth was built on a classic scientific mix-up, confusing correlation with causation. See, early studies noticed that moderate drinkers happened to be healthier, but it wasn't the alcohol that was causing the good health. It was other things. Moderate drinkers often had higher incomes, they ate better, they exercised more. And here's the real kicker. The non-drinker group in those studies often included former heavy drinkers who had quit because they already had health problems, which completely skewed the results. So once you account for all those other lifestyle factors, the new science is crystal clear. The health benefits of alcohol just disappear. And what's left behind are the risks. We now have clear, established links between drinking and a higher risk for several types of cancer, not to mention depression and anxiety. And that whole good for your heart theory, yeah, it hasn't just been questioned, it's been pretty thoroughly debunked. Okay, Section 4, the sober curious generation. So who is really taking all this new science to heart? The data points overwhelmingly to one group in particular, young adults. I mean, this is a complete cultural flip. For decades, young people were the demographic that drank the most. But now, they're the ones who are the least likely to drink. Only half of adults under 35 drink, compared to 56% of those who are older. And this chart right here explains exactly why that's happening. A stunning 2/3 of young adults now see moderate drinking as harmful. That's way more than any other age group. Their behavior is a direct reflection of this belief because, they've grown up hearing a totally different message about alcohol's risks than older generations did. It's not just one thing either. It's more like a perfect storm. Analysis from Professor Sarah McMullen points to 3 key drivers. First, this generation is just more health aware. Second, the social rules have changed. Things like mocktails and dry January make it way more acceptable not to drink. And third, it's just simple economics. For a lot of young people, alcohol is an expensive luxury they're willing to go without. The data also shows a really interesting gender divide. Overall, women's reported drinking has actually dropped more sharply than men's. And while the drink preferences still lean along those traditional lines, beer for men, wine for women, some experts suggest the bigger drop among women might be tied to a greater focus on health and wellness in general. So you put all this data together, and it really paints a picture of a society that's changing. It begs the question, what does this all mean for the future of socializing, for the future of happy hour? Well, one obvious question is whether people are just swapping one substance for another. And honestly, the answer is it's complicated. Gallup's data says no, that marijuana use has stayed pretty steady. But then other national surveys suggest that, yeah, it's going up for adults over 26, but it's actually dropping for younger adults. So the evidence is pretty conflicted, and the jury's definitely still out. And this quote from Dr. Gail Donofrio at Yale really highlights a huge challenge in this whole potential swap. It's pretty easy to define a standard drink of alcohol, right? But as she points out, that kind of standardization just doesn't exist for cannabis yet. And that makes it way, way harder to communicate the risks, which, remember, is the key thing driving this whole alcohol trend in the first place. But before we go ahead and declare this a permanent new normal, we should probably hear a final word of caution from Professor Dermody. She's basically saying, let's pump the brakes a little. While this data is striking, scientists are waiting to see if these numbers hold steady over the next few years. That's what will tell us if this is a real, lasting cultural shift or just a temporary trend. So all of this leaves us with a really fundamental question about our social future. If grabbing a drink is no longer the default way we hang out, what comes next? As our understanding of health changes, our rituals for connection probably have to change too. What that's going to look like? Well, that's a story that's still being written.